So in this video, I'm going to go over some fundamental chemistry that you might find quite helpful for understanding cell biology. So this is chemistry at a really basic level. If you're a proper chemist, go and find some proper chemistry videos, but this is just enough that you need to understand some of the fundamental concepts in cellular biology. So I'm going to start with just a recap of some chemical notation. So each element has its own symbol. And the ones that we most commonly use in biology are C, which is carbon. We have H, which is hydrogen. We have O, which is oxygen. We have N, which is nitrogen. So those are the most important elements that we'll come across. Other elements that we might meet are K is potassium. Na is sodium, Ca is calcium, you might meet Fe, which is iron. But most of the chemistry that's important we can actually cover with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and nitrogen. And just to remind you of a little bit of chemical notation, so when we draw chemicals, then we tend to draw them like this. So for example, water is H2O. So it's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And we draw that structure like that. Okay, so there's our oxygen, there's our 2 hydrogens, and that there represents a single covalent bond. So covalent means that the atoms are actually sharing electrons between them. It's quite a strong type of chemical bond. We might have CO2, so carbon dioxide. That would be central carbon, and then 2 oxygens coming off either side. And there we've got double bonds. So they would be stronger than the single bond in the water molecule above. And then we might have, we can have triple bonds. So for example, we can have a cyanide group. So we'd have a central carbon and a nitrogen. And then we'd have, on the other side, we'd have a group called R. So R equals the rest of the molecule. So if you see R, that could be any number of different chemical groups. It depends on the molecule that we're talking about. But in this case, we're not really interested in what's in R. We're interested in this bond here. That would be a triple bond. So carbon and nitrogens can bind to each other with a triple bond, which is even stronger. Okay? So what you'll notice with our 4 main elements is that they have a characteristic number of bonds that they tend to form if they're forming covalent bonds in a structure. So carbon will always form 4 bonds. So here we've got 2 bonds to this oxygen and 2 bonds to this oxygen. That's a total of 4. Here we've got 1 bond to the R group and 3 bonds to the nitrogen. So carbon always forms 4 bonds. Hydrogen only forms 1 bond. So here we've got hydrogen bonding to oxygen. It can only bond to 1 thing at a time. Oxygen binds to 2 things at a time. So here it's 2 different hydrogens. Here, it's both of those bonds are to the same central carbon, and nitrogen has 3 bonds. So here we've got that triple bond to carbon. So in all the chemical structures you see, there should be that characteristic number of bonds if we're thinking about covalent bonding. So that's where we've got a sort of proper strong bond where we share electrons. These guys down here, they don't tend to form bonds in the same way. They tend to form ionic bonds. Because they tend to be have a positive charge on them. So in fact, all of these, so K as an ion will be K plus. So that means it's lost an electron, which is negatively charged. So it's left with a positive charge. Sodium is a plus. calcium is a 2 plus, and iron can either be 2 plus or 3 plus. But we'll meet ions in a different sort of a way. But when we talk about covalent bonds, these are the important ones in terms of the number of bonds that they form. So that's how chemical notation works. You might always also see a chemical notation that looks like this. So you might have a central carbon, and then you've got something that looks like this. So I'll just call these groups 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they could be any chemical group you like. These bonds sticking out with a triangle means that the group 4 sticks out of the page. So this is attempting to give some three-dimensional notation. So in this case, 4 is sticking out of the page, and 2 sticks into the page. I.e. goes behind, whereas group 4 was sticking in front. So the dotted lines means it's going behind the atom, the little triangles means it's sticking out in front of the atom. Okay, so those are some key notations for you. Okay, so those are the notations, but we've also got some important properties that we need to think about in terms of biological molecules. So one of those is polarity. So polarity is about how the electrons are shared in a molecule. Okay, so the electrons in molecules, if they've got a covalent bond, they're shared, but sometimes they're shared equally and sometimes they're shared unequally. So if I start with a molecule of oxygen, so it's just O2, 2 oxygens bound to each other. Because it's the same atom, both of them are oxygen, both of them have the same affinity for electrons. So there are electrons sort of buzzing all over this molecule, and they will be relatively evenly distributed. Okay, so we've got even So we've got an even distribution of electrons, so that makes that molecule non-polar. Okay, so that happens in 2 different cases usually. So either we have it if the elements are the same. So in this case, they're both oxygens, they've got the same affinity for electrons, or carbon and hydrogen. They've got very similar affinities for electrons, so they tend to share electrons nice and evenly. Now this is a bit different to a molecule like water. So there we've got oxygens and hydrogens. And oxygen has a high affinity for electrons. So what happens is effectively that oxygen steals the electrons from the hydrogen. So the hydrogens won't have very many electrons, but then there'll be a sort of bulge, and all of the electrons are mostly around the oxygen. Okay, so the oxygen is kind of stolen the electrons, whereas the hydrogen has given up electrons. Not completely. It's still got the electrons. It's still a covalent bond, but the majority of the electrons are around the oxygen, not around the hydrogen. So it's not evenly distributed. So that's so we've got an unequal distribution. That makes it a polar molecule. So that happens when we have 2 different elements. So in this case, we've got oxygen and hydrogen. It might be nitrogen and hydrogen. It might be carbon and oxygen. It might be carbon and nitrogen. So if the 2 atoms in the bond are different, then it's likely that they will have a polar and unequal distribution. And we formally notate this in the following way. So we would put next to this oxygen, because the oxygen's got most of the electrons and electrons are negatively charged, we call this delta negative and we call this delta positive. So the delta means a little bit. It's not fully negative, it's not become an ion, but it is a little bit negative compared to the hydrogen, which is a little bit positive. So that's what we mean by polarity. And that has quite an important implication for biological systems, because it gives rise to hydrogen bonds. And these are really important in terms of understanding biological systems. So if I think about two water molecules, I've now got two water molecules next to each other. Right, so they're both H2O. And if we draw on our delta negatives and positives, so the oxygen is delta negative, the hydrogen is positive, and again that's positive, negative, positive. Okay, so both of these are polar molecules. We've now got, on this atom here, we're a little bit negative on the oxygen, and on this one we're a little bit positive. So positive and negative things attract each other, so you can get what's called a hydrogen bond. So they're not properly chemically bonded to each other. It's relatively easy to disrupt this type of bonding, but they are attracted to each other. So that means that water molecules will stick to each other because of their polarity. They can form these hydrogen bonds. So this means that we've got an emergent property that comes out of this. So our polar, like water, it will form hydrogen bonds. Therefore, we call it hydrophilic. So any polar molecule can form hydrogen bonds with water. And remember, obviously, water is surrounding most of the things in our cells. So if you've got a polar molecule, so you've got anything that's relying on oxygens and hydrogens, nitrogens, hydrogens over here, that's what we call hydrophilic, equals water loving. If you're non-polar, you can't form hydrogen bonds because your electrons are evenly distributed. You've not got positive and negative bits, it's all evenly distributed. So you can't form a hydrogen bond, therefore you are hydrophobic. You are water hating. Okay. And that's really important when we come to think about things like the cell membrane, which is mostly made of lipids, which are hydrophobic, so they would repel water, and that's what allows you to have that barrier around the cell. The last thing that you probably ought to be aware of is acids and bases. So some molecules, when they're in water, have a tendency to either accept or donate protons, which are H+. So H+ is a proton. And there are two types of chemicals that do this. So one of them would be an acid, so something like a carboxylic acid. And this will become important when we're thinking about protein structure. So a carboxylic acid has this structure. It's got a carbon, double bond oxygen, and an OH. When that goes into water, what will happen to that is that becomes carbon. Nothing happens to the double bond oxygen, but that becomes O- plus H+. Okay, so that proton is able to diffuse away, but here we are left with a negative charge. So our molecule becomes negatively charged, and that's because it's an acid, it's donated a proton. Okay, so in the right conditions, which in most of the cases actually just in water, if it's a sufficiently strong acid, it will donate H+ and become negative. A base does the opposite. So we might have RNH2. Again, that's a common group that we find on proteins. That would become RNH3+. So it's an accepted proton, and there we end up with a positive charge left behind. Okay, so actually if you have an acidic group and a basic group, they would then become attracted to each other if they were in sufficiently close proximity. So that's an overview of the most important bits of chemistry that you need to understand cell biology. As I say, it's a very rapid overview. It's a fairly basic overview, so obviously the chemistry of this does get much more complicated, but as a survival kit for understanding cell biology, that's the chemistry that you need.